Imagine a life or death challenge where every decision counts, just like Squid Game. What if I told you someone I know lived through their own version of it? Could it happen to you too? Squid Game took the world by storm, showcasing the desperation and choices people make under extreme pressure. But what if this wasn't just a game? Today, I'll share the story of my brother's real-life nightmare, one that felt like stepping into that very world. It all started with a simple choice: take a risky business venture or play it safe with his current job. What seemed like a small decision at the time quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. My brother found himself in a web of high-pressure deals, unreliable people, and broken promises. As his commitments piled up, it became clear that his future was hanging by a thread. He had no choice but to continue, even though every step forward felt like he was walking on a tightrope. As the days went on, the stakes grew even higher. At one point, he had to choose between keeping a promise to a trusted friend or breaking that promise to save his career. Betrayal was on the horizon, but so was the risk of losing everything he had worked for. Each decision started to feel like a game of Russian roulette, with his personal and professional life at risk. The pressure wasn't just external, it was internal too. My brother was battling himself, questioning his morals and values every step of the way. No one could understand the mental toll this took on him. He was isolated, torn between choices, and losing hope. But there was one turning point, an ultimatum that changed everything. The moment came when my brother had to choose whether to expose a corrupt partner, risking his reputation, or cover up the truth to protect himself. It was like a Squid Game scenario. Play the game and risk everything, or bow out and face destruction. In the end, he made a decision that would haunt him forever. The consequences were far more severe than he imagined. Everything he'd fought for came crumbling down in an instant. This was his Squid Game moment. Looking back, my brother's journey wasn't just about the decisions he made. It was about survival. It's a story of resilience, of learning that sometimes the hardest choices come with the biggest costs. But no matter how dark it gets, there's always a way to rebuild. Have you ever faced a challenge that felt like a nightmare, where every decision had major consequences? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about the real-life Squid Game moments we all go through. And don't forget to check out more videos on this channel for more amazing stories that will inspire and challenge you. South Korea, known for its rich culture and modern advancements, once hid a terrible secret that remained unnoticed for decades. Behind closed doors, there was a horrifying place that survivors later compared to concentration camps. Some even called it South Korea's version of the Holocaust. For others, it felt like the terrifying games from Squid Game. But this was real, and the stakes were life or death. For years, the suffering of those trapped in these camps stayed buried in silence. Many victims, broken and scarred, chose not to speak about what they endured. Some stayed silent for over 25 years, too afraid of judgment or retaliation. The conditions in these camps were unimaginable. Survivors described them as places filled with cruelty, like scenes from a war movie. What were supposed to be welfare centers were, in reality, prisons where children, adults, and even the elderly were treated inhumanely. When the truth finally came to light, people were shocked and outraged. How could such a system exist in a modern society? And how had it gone on for so long, hidden under layers of government support and secrecy? These camps, called the Brothers' Home, became one of the darkest and most shameful parts of South Korea's history. Although the camps were eventually shut down, the pain and trauma they caused never disappeared. The survivors still carry the scars of what they endured, and their stories serve as a reminder of this tragic past. In the early 1980s, life in South Korea seemed normal on the surface. Families went about their routines. Children laughed and played on the streets, and the busy cities were filled with hope for a better future. But behind this calm facade, something terrifying was happening. An operation that would tear apart families and destroy innocent lives. Chong, a 12-year-old boy, was one of the many victims caught in this nightmare. He was bright, responsible, and full of promise. Always at the top of his class, Chong had already taken on the role of caring for his sick mother. He cooked meals, kept the house in order, and did everything he could to help. To his mother, he was her lifeline, the only source of hope and stability. In 1982, everything changed. Chong went missing after he went to the city with a kind neighbor, an older man who promised to show him the sights and sounds of urban life. For Chong, it was an exciting adventure. He was amazed by the bright city lights, played arcade games, and enjoyed the lively atmosphere. It was so different from his quiet, small home, and he was thrilled. But what started as an exciting adventure soon turned into a nightmare. The neighbor stepped away for a moment, leaving Chong alone. That's when two policemen approached. They were calm and friendly, asking him why he was alone and offering to take him home. Chong, trusting them as any child would, agreed without hesitation. Instead of taking him home, the officers led him to the police station. That was where his nightmare began. Around the same time, another child, 7-year-old Miss Lee, was out with her younger brother when two policemen approached them. The officers promised to take them home and reassured them along the way. But hours later, after spending time at the police station, the children were led to a white van. The van seemed normal on the outside, but inside, it was a different story. It was full of other children and adults, all scared and confused, not understanding what was happening. They didn't know where they were going, but it was clear something awful was about to happen. When the van arrived at its destination, it was a place that felt more like a prison than anything else. The first thing the children noticed was how unsettling and oppressive it felt. It looked more like a prison than a place meant to help people, with high concrete walls surrounding the area and guards everywhere. Heavy steel doors were locked from the outside, keeping everyone trapped inside, committing countless atrocities against the citizens of South Korea during his rule. The country saw massive protests and riots as people fought against his military dictatorship. President Chun's rule was known for many accusations of human rights abuses, particularly against those who spoke out against him. When the truth about the brothers' home was revealed, there was hope that justice would be served and the survivors would find peace. In 1987, the camp was shut down in response to public outrage, but even after it closed, the horrors didn't end. The program changed names and moved to new locations, allowing the abuse to continue in secret. For the survivors, freedom was complicated. Many had been taken away so young that they couldn't remember their families or where they came from. With no clear way to return to their old lives, some ended up in orphanages, homeless shelters, or mental health facilities, still carrying the trauma of years of abuse. The emotional scars were deep. Survivors often felt isolated, ashamed, and rejected by a society that saw them as products of a system meant for the unfit. This only made their struggle harder, as they faced challenges rebuilding their lives and trusting others. Reuniting with family was nearly impossible for many. Some survivors didn't even remember their family members' names or where they had lived. Families who had spent years searching for their loved ones often never got the closure they needed. Many survivors faced health problems because of years of hard work, poor food, and being drugged. They had a hard time adjusting back to society, finding jobs, or building relationships. The emotional pain, combined with rejection by society, made them feel like they didn't belong. For many years, the survivors of the brothers' home kept their pain to themselves. They feared being judged and thought no one would listen to them. The government's involvement in their suffering, along with society's indifference, made justice feel out of reach. But eventually, they found the strength to speak up, starting a long fight for recognition and accountability. In 2012, more than 25 years after the original camps closed, a few survivors began to share their stories. One of them was Mr. Han, who had been just 9 years old when he was taken to the camp. He stood outside a courthouse holding a sign that said, "I am 37 years old now, but the story I'm telling is from when I was just 9 years old. The most important thing we're asking for is to find normal again." His protest inspired others to speak out, and more survivors came forward, sharing the abuse, forced labor, and cruelty they endured. Even though they showed great courage, the survivors faced huge obstacles. The courts and police rejected their cases because too much time had passed. This meant that many of the people responsible, including Park, the camp's director, would never be held accountable. Park, who had made a fortune from the camp, spent his last years living comfortably. When reporters asked him about his actions, he claimed he couldn't remember, blaming old age and dementia. He passed away in 2016, taking many of the answers the survivors needed with him. The survivors didn't give up. They spent almost 3 years camped outside the courthouse, pushing for the case to be reopened. In 2020, their efforts paid off when the court announced it would reopen the case, focusing on the abuse that happened in the 1970s and 1980s. Although the case was reopened, there was little progress in getting justice or compensation for the survivors. The government, which had once funded the brothers' home, didn't offer any apology or admit its role in the abuse. For the survivors, this lack of accountability was hard to accept. They had hoped for justice not just for themselves, but for all the others who suffered and died in the camps. Instead, they were left with many unanswered questions and emotional wounds that hadn't healed. For the survivors, the fight wasn't just about punishment. It was about being heard and recognized. They wanted society to understand their pain and make sure nothing like this would ever happen again. As adults, they had found their voices and were determined to use them. Even if real justice remained out of reach, the story of the brothers' home didn't end when the camp was closed, or even when the case was reopened years later. For the survivors, the pain and trauma continued to shape their lives. Their fight for recognition and closure wasn't just about seeking justice, it was also about healing and reclaiming their identities. The abuse, hard labor, and mistreatment they went through stayed with them long after they were freed. Many of them had nightmares, flashbacks, and felt ashamed, even though they were the victims of an unfair system. For years, society's lack of understanding made things worse, leaving survivors isolated and unsupported. One of the hardest things they faced was the stigma. Being associated with the brothers' home made them seem unfit or undesirable in the eyes of many people. This unfair judgment made it harder for them to fit back into society, find stable jobs, or build meaningful relationships. Some survivors couldn't even find their families, as they had been taken so young that their memories of home had faded. Despite all this pain, the survivors showed incredible strength. They began speaking out, sharing their stories to make sure the horrors of the brothers' home weren't forgotten. Through protests, interviews, and documentaries, they brought attention to one of South Korea's darkest periods, forcing people to face the truth. Their fight for recognition wasn't just about their suffering. It was about dignity. They wanted the government to admit its role in what happened, offer apologies, and provide compensation. They wanted the system that had failed them to take responsibility and make sure future generations wouldn't go through the same thing. Although their calls for justice often went unanswered, their determination inspired others to stand with them. The survivors' struggle wasn't just about them. It was a call for all of society to act. They wanted to make sure that no one else would have to experience what they did. By keeping their stories alive, they hoped to teach future generations about the dangers of unchecked power, corruption, and cruelty. Remembering this tragedy is important because it shows how easy it is for society to ignore injustice when it's disguised as something good. The survivors' stories are not just a reminder of the suffering they went through, but also of their strength and courage in fighting back. The legacy of the brothers' home is one of pain, but also of resilience. The survivors' fight for justice and their efforts to share the truth have made sure that this dark chapter of history won't be forgotten. Their struggle teaches us the importance of standing up against injustice and shows the strength of the human spirit. Through their voices, the victims of the brothers' home have turned their suffering into a message of hope and awareness. They've ensured that future generations will remember the past and work to create a kinder, more compassionate world. As we come to the end of this harrowing story of the brothers' home in South Korea, we're reminded of the importance of learning from the past to build a better future. The courage of the survivors in sharing their stories and seeking justice inspires us to stand against injustice and fight for what's right. What are your thoughts on this case? How can we, as a society, ensure that tragedies like this are never repeated? Let us know your views in the comments below. If this story moved you or taught you something new, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others to spread awareness, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Together, let's keep these voices alive and work toward a world where compassion and justice prevail. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.